Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. As always, the best way to support this transmission is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack. The annual gets you a discount, and that's the best way to support me. We do off-the-record Zoom calls, and I do my weekly analysis for supporters only. And you can listen to the podcast ad-free. As a supporter, you can donate on the website, purchase a console if you want to chat with me, and do check out all of my affiliates, Start Mail, and what not. Joining us for the first time on the podcast is prolific author John Hamer, who hails from Yorkshire in the north of England. Originally, he spent most of his working life as a corporate slave to the IT industry before seeing the light and finally escaping from the dreary, soul-destroying confines of the corporatocracy over 20 years ago. Since then, he's been a full-time professional geopolitical researcher, analyst, public speaker, and author, having written and published over half a dozen books. I've lost count. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, John.
Thank you very much, Roger. Very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. Not long ago, I had Shannon Rowan on, who's one of your co-authors on your 2022.
She's a great friend. Shannon's a great friend of mine. Yeah.
She's great. And you guys did the book, Welcome to the Masquerade, Prelude to the Coming Reset. So I haven't read that yet. I've been perusing the Falsification of History, Our Distorted Reality. And people can check out the link in the description to look at all of your other books, but maybe for starters, whatever you want to tell us about your background, and then getting into writing on the New World Order, or whatever you want to call it, them.
Okay. Yeah. I spent all my working life in IT. I was an IT consultant latterly, traveling the country, advising large corporates on their IT requirements. It seems a very long time ago now, but it's just over 25 years ago when I kind of left that world. Because of that, just prior to that, I was woken up. I hate that phrase, but I was woken up by the death of Princess Diana, and I think quite a few people were at that time. And it just sent me down all sorts of rabbit holes, because I didn't believe the story. The story just didn't hang together. We had some friends who were in Paris at that time, on the day she died, and they'd been out for a meal in the evening, come back, flopped on the bed in the hotel room, switched on the TV, as you do, and they saw images of Princess Diana walking into the ambulance. And they came back and told me this, and I said, no, that can't be right, because she never regained consciousness. She was taken to the hospital by ambulance, and she was dead on arrival. And they said, well, no, that's not what we saw. We definitely saw news footage of Diana walking into the ambulance. And I was really curious. And so that's what started me down this path. I started looking into all kinds of different stuff. And, I quickly realized that the world was a totally different place to what they tell us. And, of course, 9/11 as well was a biggie. And that kind of, really, really made me sit up and take notice. As soon as it happened, I just thought, this isn't real. This is all theatre. And of course it is. And so it just went from there. I started writing a few articles to various different websites. They would very kindly ask me to write stuff, and I'd write bits of stuff that I'd researched at that time. And it just kind of went from there. And then eventually somebody said, you should write a book. Your articles are really good. Why don't you, write a book? And I thought, well, I can't do that. But anyway, I gave it a go, and it took me ages, but I did. I wrote The Falsification of History, which was my first book, the first of 9. And that was published in about 2012, although it took me just under 3 years to write it, because it was a new skill to me. I'd not done anything like that before. And that kind of Falsification of History just encapsulates, to my mind, and I think I get a lot of really excellent reviews for it as well, in a lot of other people's minds as well. It actually kind of it's like a starter program for the awake, if you like, and and it goes through a lot of historical events and tells you the real truth about them. And it just went from there. I've written books on all kinds of different topics. I've written books on JFK, the assassination, from a completely different angle to what most people have. And again, we'll touch on that because I think it's going to actually, overlap with some of the stuff that you want to talk about anyway. I've written about the Titanic. I've written about the banking industry. And I've written a couple of novels as well that are full of truth bombs. My latest book is called 60 Degrees South. And that is about Antarctica, what's really going on. And that's a novel, but it's a novel that's full of truth bombs, as I say. So, yeah, there's a whole variety of stuff there, enough to whet the most serious of appetites, I think, on truth stuff. So, yeah, it's been a long road, but and it's certainly been an interesting road as well, to say the least.
And before sort of getting to the starting with the big picture, I do want to ask you. I was watching some interviews with you. I think it was John Water.
John Waters, yeah.
Yeah, Waters. Why some people like us have this urge to peer behind the veil, and others, they don't care to, they don't want to. You can use, there's so many different symbolisms, Plato's cave, this, that, the other. What's sort of your insight there? Yeah, well,
unfortunately, I don't really have an answer, but it is something that I've discussed on many, many occasions, not just with interviewers, but with friends and family as well. The ones who are awake. And there is no real answer to it. There doesn't seem to be any overlaying pattern to what makes people, become truthers in a nutshell. Whatever demographic you look at, there is a vast cross section of all different views within each demographic. It's nothing to do with intelligence. It's nothing to do with race, color, creed, religion, nothing. There just doesn't seem to be an answer to it. And the best answer that I could come up with, it might seem a little bit off the wall, but the best answer that I could come up with, speaking to people and debating it and, washing ideas around, is that we, the ones that are aware of what's going on, are old souls. Right, we've been around the block a few times, we've been here a few times, and we do retain that knowledge from previous lives. This is what I believe. Some people may think that's ridiculous, but this is what I believe, and that's the only reasonable conclusion I've been able to come to with regard to that particular question. It is the $64,000 question, of course. It's just it's an unanswerable one, I'm afraid, but that's the closest I can get to it.
Yeah, and I did notice, as you pointed out, that there are people that are religious that see it, and others that are not. So then there are some common denominators there, and then maybe to look at falsification of history. So I'm a history major. I taught history, high school, university, and for me, history was a way, and then later international relations. In my case, geopolitics was sort of like the science of trying to explain the world, because when you look at like your book or other areas, you look at demographics, you look at population, you look at history, you look at science, you look at so many inputs to come out with the output. And so, I mean, if people just peruse your table of contents, it's a lot of topics that we've, not all, but some that we've touched on the podcast. Everything from false flags, ancient history, bloodlines, Freemasons, Bilderberg, of course, Cecil Rhodes's Roundtable, CFR, Trilateral, the world wars. And just real quick, for me, in a nutshell, I see it as there's been a ruling elite essentially since the beginning of history. Maybe they're cyclical, but there's always existed some sort of ruling elite. I like Mark Passio's term as calling them the occultocracy. And effectively, in a nutshell, what they've been looking for is total global domination. And so if you want to just maybe starting there, what's your insight on who they are, what they want, and the methods that they're deploying to achieve their goals?
Yeah. Again, I mean, there's no definitive answer to who they are. It is a mishmash of many different factions, but they all have this one common aim, and that is to subjugate, the mere mortals of this world, such as you and I. The only way that they can retain their power is by creating a fake reality, if you like. I know that this is a very glib answer, but this was the premise of the falsification of history. The fact that they have to create all these fake, not all the events are fake, that they didn't happen, but they're fake in the sense that they didn't happen for the reasons that they tell us. This is how they maintain control, because the only way that a few thousand people, and that's all we're talking about, can control billions and billions of us is taking away our power. And I think it was George Orwell said that if you destroy someone's history, then it kind of destroys them as well. That's very much paraphrased, but that was the kind of idea he was trying to get over in 1984, that they eliminated, the truth about the people's history, and they use that as a way of controlling us, which they do. I mean, they don't. For example, they don't want us to understand what our origins are. So this is why they came up with nonsense like evolution and the Big Bang Theory. And I could go on and on and on, but that is the premise about, whether I write about, in effect, the way that these elites, and I hate that word too, control us through fakery. I think it was a guy called William Casey, was it, who was, it was quite high up in Reagan's government, and he said, "We'll know our disinformation campaign is complete when the American public, how did he put it? When everything that the American public believes is a lie." That was. I can't remember what position he held, but that is the kind of thing that we're talking about here. These people, they want to deceive us. That's the only way that they can control us.
And you already mentioned they want to subjugate all of humanity. For me, looking through your book, a lot of us understand this, but it seems like a lot of the people who aren't awake really do not seem to understand this point, this idea of false flag operations. And I was looking. Yeah. You mentioned a lot of stuff. Operation Northwoods. You cite James Bamford, who I interviewed early on when I started this podcast over a decade ago. So I'd interviewed James Bamford and false flags, and they use it in everything. It's and there's different forms. You mentioned 9/11, Operation Northwoods. It could be smaller events that are not necessarily related to terrorism. It's basically just something happens, and as you said, it's the official story. Its explanation is not correct. We recently had that up in your neck of the woods in UK. There was that train knife attack. Well, what do you know? That precise scenario was simulated by the authorities, or the one in Michigan, the Halloween so-called attack, and it was discovered that FBI agents undercover effectively were the ones egging on this person. And so, just your take on false flags, because it's like literally every week in some part of the world, the deep state is running a false flag, and our fellow citizens are none the wiser.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, they come in various different shapes and sizes. False flags, it can be a huge thing like 9/11, which is obviously massive and was in the news for months and months and months, if not years. Or it can be something tiny, just something that actually promulgates their agenda by making public opinion shift, a foot sideways or whatever. So yeah, there are so many different ways that they the false, things like Kennedy assassination was a false flag. I mean, they told us it was this guy called Lee Harvey Oswald. What a load of nonsense that was. But I mean, to be fair, I think there's a sizable percentage of the world's population that does believe that Kennedy was murdered by persons other than Lee Harvey Oswald. So, that's probably an exception rather than the rule. But yeah, they range from something of that size down to, like you say, things that are only in the news for maybe a day, but it just pushes public opinion the way that they want it to go. And it enables them to fulfill another part of their agenda. It might just be a tiny baby step of it, but nevertheless. So there's this whole, as you say, there's this whole range of different shapes and sizes of false flag.
What's your take on JFK, the assassination?
Right. Okay. Are you ready for this? Right. I think it's fairly unique, to be fair. And I wrote a book called JFK, A Very British Coup. Right. Now, my view is that the Kennedy assassination was conducted through the British Crown Empire, because, and again, I'm going to get some American backs up here, right? America became independent from the UK, and by the way, I've got no axe around this. I don't care. I'm just telling things as I know it. You know, I'm not doing it for any kind of ulterior motive. You know, I'm only interested in the truth. I don't care what that truth is. That's all I'm interested in. America went bankrupt in 1871. The United States of America went bankrupt in 1871, and they went cap in hand back to the British Empire, the British Crown Empire, which is slightly different. That's the financial empire, to bail them out. And Britain very kindly said, yeah, of course, we'll bail you out, but here are the conditions. You scrap the Constitution as it exists now, and you rewrite it. Yeah, this is easily provable, by the way. You know, it's not something I'm making up as I go along. Okay, so, and that new Constitution actually subsumed the United States back under the direct control of the British Crown Empire. And again, there's other people have written about this stuff as well as me. So again, it's not me making it up. And I keep repeating that because I feel really awful saying it on an American podcast, because it sounds like I'm trying to be superior in some way, but I promise you I'm not, as I'm sure you realize. And so in the book, basically, I tell all about all the different factions that wanted Kennedy's blood. And they ranged from, I'll go through a few. Okay, the CIA, the FBI. The CIA hated him because they wanted to split it all up. They said, I'll break it into a million pieces. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, he absolutely hated him, and it was reciprocated in spades. The Catholic Church, believe it or not, he upset the Catholic Church, he upset Israel, he upset the big oil, he upset Big Pharma, he upset the Federal Reserve, and he even upset that was it. Those are the major ones. Okay. But now the point is, who do all those factions come underneath? Okay. The British Crown Empire. They control the lot, every single one of them. And I present proof in my book that this is absolutely the case. So it was the British Crown Empire, and it was a guy by the name of Ian Fleming who organised it. Ian Fleming, Mr. James Bond, both for gasps of amazement, and a guy, a children's author by the name of Roald Dahl. These were both senior MI6 agents, and they were responsible for coordinating the assassination. They didn't carry it out. I believe it was carried out by something called Le Cercle, which some people may have heard of. It's a very clandestine group, but again, it's controlled by the British Crown Empire. That is not the Crown. By the Crown, I'm not talking about the royal family. I'm talking about the world financial empire, which is centred in the City of London. And by the City of London, again, just to be clear, I don't mean London itself. There is a 1 square mile area to the east of the centre of London, which is called the City. And that is a separate state in its own right, very much like Washington, D.C., and very much like the Vatican. The Vatican is the religious centre of the world. Washington, D.C. is the military centre of the world, and the City of London is the financial empire of the world. And those are sometimes call them the Triple Crown, the three elements of control. So yeah, I'm getting off the point a little bit, but I think you get what I mean. So yeah, it's easy to prove that the City of London is a separate entity to the rest of the UK. For example, it has a separate mayor to London itself, Greater London. The mayor of the City of London has a massively important role. He's a very, very important guy, but he's never mentioned in the news for some reason, and I can't understand why that might be. It's rather strange, isn't it? Now, I'll tell you how important he is. If the king, or latterly the queen, wanted to enter the city of London on business, the mayor of London greets her at a place called Temple Bar, which is the entrance, the old ancient entrance to the city of London, when it was all walled. And she has to bow to the mayor. He, now the king, has to bow to the mayor. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. And he or she is totally subservient. Can't get used to having a king. He or she is totally subservient to the mayor of the city. They have their own police service. They have their own fire service. They have everything is separate to, the laws and the financial rules and regs. Totally different to the rest of the UK. So yeah, it's a very interesting situation, and definitely, if anyone believes me or is interested in that, I would urge you to do your own research, because it's very, very revealing.
And you mentioned some stuff that was interesting to go one a step further. And I'd previously alluded to it, asked you sort of, who do you think runs the world, the occultocracy? But maybe to rephrase that, because in your book, you're talking about CFR. By the way, I've had on the podcast of the former director of the Royal Institute, Victor Bulmer Thomas, and I've had the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, Mark Leonard, on as well. But
wow.
But we hear a lot, Cecil Rhodes, the Round Table, all that sort of stuff, and then they form Royal Institute, which creates the CFR, which you talk about again in your book, the League of Nations, the United Nations, and to ask you, where do you think would be the major seats or headquarters of the globalist power? And I like how you outlined, you kind of crystallized it in a way I hadn't exactly thought of before. And these are all like city-states, right? Vatican is the religious. City of London is the financial. Clearly, Pentagon is the military arm.
Yeah.
But would you say, I guess, does the British occult royalty seem to have the biggest? Are they like the biggest faction? What would you say?
I mean, obviously, it's very, very difficult to define, but I do believe that Britain is the top dog here. I'm not just saying that because I'm a British person. I've got no affinity to this piece of land, this country, whatever you want to call it. So it's not that I'm kind of blowing our own trumpets in that sense. As I said to you before, all I'm interested in is the truth. So yeah, I do believe that it is Britain that is the major controlling factor in just about everything that goes on in the world. I'm not quite sure how that would relate to the Far East, China, for example. That is not something that I've particularly researched, but certainly the Western world, I would say, is totally run from the City of London. Can I just tell you a little story actually about the City of London? And I told you earlier that I used to be an IT consultant. One of my clients was the City of London Corporation, which is the controlling council, if you like, of the City of London. And they were interested in the software from the company that I was representing. And I had to go and do a presentation. And as we went through the presentation, they loved the software. They thought, yeah, it's great, it's just what we need. This, for all it was financial software for all the incomings and outgoings of all the different transactions. And they said, well, how large is the currency field? How many digits is the currency field? And I said, well, it's 9 digits. What is 9 digits? Is that 100 trillion, or is that 100 billion? I can't quite remember. Anyway, my brain it's gone foggy.
Yeah,
but anyway, it's a huge number, and this is per transaction thing. And they said, "Oh, that's if we go ahead, we're going to have to negotiate you changing that." I said, "Well, that's a massive job." I said, "How much? What kind of digits did you want?" I expected them to say 10 or something, and they said 14. So this is the kind of numbers we're talking about: 14-digit financial transactions. They apps finances. This is a tiny, tiny square mile in the centre of London. So Yeah, so we did it. We changed it for them, and they loved it. And I won't be surprised if their requirements have gone up a bit higher than 14 now, because that was a long time ago. Yeah, so that's just to give some idea of the kind of numbers of kind of figures that they are dealing with.
To go back, you mentioned something that I was going to ask you, and you said you haven't researched it, but maybe just to get your speculation. I've had a number of guests like Richard Poe and others that agree with you that the British Empire, whatever its form, is one of the primary seats of control, and the East. Then Russia and China. I've been saying. I mean, my view is that the East. I mean, all countries have been penetrated, and I just sort of view China. It's not as clear, but I feel behind the scenes they are connected to what we're talking about, and they seem to be launching similar programs of technocracy, in the multipolar countries. Just any further, extrapolation or speculation on your end regarding the non-Western world?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer. I mean, this is why I said what I said. It's not something that I particularly looked into in any depth, and even the stuff that I'm talking about now, it was quite a while ago that I looked at it. But yeah, I mean, I think the glib answer is that anything's up for grabs, really, in terms of who controls who and what. So I'm sorry to be a bit vague, but honestly, it's just, I don't think anyone really knows, apart from the people who are actually involved in it, exactly how it all hangs together. There are certainly lots and lots of different factions. Now they actually intermesh and interlock. If somebody tells me that they think it's this or that way that they interact, I don't believe them, because how do they know? How can you possibly know? This is all actually, it's under the carpet. There's no overt information about how all that stuff hangs together. So yeah, I'm sorry to be vague, but
no, that's fine. And I want you to be like that. And I saved this question for later. I'll bring it up now. And you touched a bit on it with right. John Waters. Just the process of researching your book and sourcing. Right. You mentioned, I think, something. It was easier to research a decade ago, and I'm finding this now. Like, stuff is simply disappearing off the internet, or it's still there, but we don't have access to it because of the search engines. It's mind-boggling how much stuff is disappearing. So, just a quick thought on that.
Yeah, well, it's the old Orwellian memory hole, isn't it, for those who've read 1984? If you haven't, then the memory hole in 1984, the main guy in 1984, Winston Smith, he worked as a history alterer. That wasn't his official title, but that's the best way I can describe it. And he used to trawl through newspapers, and anything that was politically incorrect from years ago, he would remove it from newspaper records and stick it physically down this hole, which was a memory hole which went down into the furnaces in the bowels of the building. So that's what we mean by the memory hole. But yeah, they're doing exactly what happened in 1984. They are changing history constantly to suit their own agenda. So yeah, that's what it's all about. And obviously the internet is massively censored now. Absolutely massively. The things called fact checkers, and if you try and get to the truth of something, oh well, that's not. It comes back with the answer that this is not. This is not fact. This is just speculation or a conspiracy theory. All that kind of stuff, which is slightly different to what you were saying, but it's connected. And so not only do they delete information, they cover it up, and they also obfuscate it by these people that are called fact checkers. So they do it in various different ways, and it's so hard to get at the truth. I always say when I do my stand-up talk that my favorite way of researching is through going to libraries, going to the reference section of libraries and looking at really old books. Because in a really old book, you're more likely to find the truth than you are in any recently published book on any topic you care to name, whether it be history, science, geography, whatever, So, yeah.
Yeah, and we have in the EU now. I mean, it's unbelievable. I was just tweeting at Frau Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen. They're unveiling the EU democracy shield. It's so Orwellian, right? And then their chat control, they're pushing through. It's like, and I think I tweeted something to the tune of, so let me get this straight. You guys, this is like East Germany and Nazi Germany, where you can read all of our communications now, but we cannot read yours. We don't forget the WhatsApp messages with Albert Bourla that she erased. But just on Orwell real quick, because I saw you mentioned this elsewhere. By the way, I'm showing this sticker. I got this COVID 1984 sticker I have here on my desk. But but I kind of agree with your assessment. I reread 1984. And I feel like in a way that Orwell was privy to this information. It doesn't make sense for me that he was very smart. No doubt that he was an intelligent guy. But how is it possible that literally the program he described is, you just described the memory hole version? We're having the literally like chat control and democracy shield. I mean, that's all literally Orwellian. I think he was an insider, and I think it was part of some psyop for them to put that out there to get us acclimated to it.
That's absolutely possible. I wouldn't disagree with that. Well, George Orwell, for those who are not aware, was a member of something called the Fabian Society, which is a British institution. And again, it's part of the overall control mechanism. It's an ultra left wing group, and he was quite a senior guy within that ultra left wing group. And so that's how I believe he was privy to that information. A friend of mine called Mark Devlin. I don't know if you've ever come across Mark's work. Have you?
Yeah. I mean to get him on. He's on my guest list, so eventually I want to get him on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Mark's a friend of mine, and he's just recently written a book called "No One's Dad is a Plumber." And what the logic behind that is that all these people who are put into positions of power, they all have either in the UK aristocratic backgrounds, in places like the States they have senior backgrounds. Like the Kennedy dynasty, the Bush dynasty. They're all old money, if you like, and nobody's dad is a plumber, and he's specifically talking there about rock music because that's his thing. He talks about the corruption within the music industry and how all that came about, and he links it outside of that as well. So it's not just about music, but it's just part of the bigger picture. But it's an interesting concept that no one's dad is a plumber, and they're not. Another friend of mine, Don Waterson, he's just writing a book which I'm editing, and that is about all the genealogy of all the different people within power throughout the world, and all their genealogies all merge back into the British royal family. Every single one of them, even the American ones. People like George Bush, you can link them back to British royalty in just a few generations. So they're all part of this same group of people, the same group that has controlled us for millennia, that originally came from ancient Babylon. They can trace their ancestry almost, but not quite, back to ancient Babylon. But it's believed it was the same group of people from there that went to ancient Greece, to ancient Rome, and then spread itself through Europe and eventually out west. So they're all the same bloodline.
Just on that note, since you kind of brought it up, and this is something I've been bringing up as an important point, I'm finding that increasingly among alternative media, the podcast sphere, independent media, whatever you want to call it, the opposition, there's a lot of grift, but intelligence operations. And to that note of, and I love the title now. No one's dad is a plumber, is it?
That's right.
Alex Jones's father is, CIA. Tucker Carlson, CIA. Andrew Tate, CIA. Candace Owens met some guy in a few weeks later who's like British upper class, marries him. Someone told me recently, I'm not saying everyone who's father or grandfather is not a plumber is necessarily controlled opposition, but would you agree that there's a segment of alternative media that is um, controlled opposition? And I'm not necessarily saying all these people for sure, but we're seeing patterns.
Yeah.
That's my point.
Absolutely. I mean, that is a big thing, isn't it? Who was it that said, was it Stalin that said the best way to influence the opposition is to control it? Something along those lines. That wasn't Lenin, was it? Yeah. Yeah, that's what they do. I mean, it makes sense. You know, if that was you or I in this position, you know, and with the same mindset as them, that's what we'd do, isn't it? We'd control the opposition because it's very easy to do. You know, when you've got limitless amounts of money and power, which they do have, it's so very easy for them to create a false opposition. They do it all the time. Look at I don't know how aware you are of the politics in the UK, but as an example, a guy called Nigel Farage, who started a new political party and which is absolutely growing like crazy. You know, he's one of them. He's one of them, without
Trump,
a doubt.
I mean, I'd argue the same in America. Trump is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd argue Trump is similar.
Yeah, controlled opposition, without a doubt. I mean, some of the stuff he does, you know, you think, wow, you know, maybe he's on our side after all, but then you just something completely the other end of the spectrum and you think, nah, he's not.
Yeah. Then, you know, I did also want to ask you, just to get this point out of the way. There's a little bit of, I don't know, your mic, maybe if you could just adjust it a bit. It was getting, scratching, but I think we're okay now. The sourcing, when you research your book, and as you said earlier, I tend to shy away people who say this is the definitive answer. And when you're researching history, like I went through it, you've been writing about it. You can have a whole host of sources, but as you said earlier, my problem is that on some issues, it's difficult to come to an absolute conclusion because we will never know. And this is part of the process, writing like your books. You get close, you get somewhere near, but you can never definitively be sure. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point, actually, and I try and make that point whenever I can, that I'm not saying that this is the absolute definitive answer or the absolute definitive way that things happen, but bearing everything else in mind that kind of corroborates it, it's very likely that it is. But if anybody's got any information to the contrary that will shoot that idea down, then I'll listen to it. Absolutely. I have this analogy that I use. I don't know whether I've used it in any of the podcasts you've seen me do before, but for the benefit of the viewers and listeners today, I have this analogy, and I talk about a 10 billion piece jigsaw puzzle. Reality is a 10 billion piece jigsaw puzzle. And the more pieces you put into this picture, the more reality that you insert into this picture, the clearer the picture becomes, which then in turn allows you to put more and more pieces in place, because you can actually see the relationship between this piece and that piece. And, you know, it's not infallible, of course, but it is one way, it's one methodology that I use when I'm deciding whether I believe anything and make it, and therefore it's worth researching further, or whether I kind of just put it on the back burner because I'm not sure about it. So yeah, it's not an exact science. It never can be. But the best that you can do is say, yeah, well, that fits in what I know with all the other stuff that's going on around that. So that piece does fit. So I'll stick that one in there. Yeah, it's just a methodology that I kind of use.
That's a great analogy, and I share that, and that's what I try to do with the podcast, which is why I bring people like yourself and from many people from different flavors to give us their little puzzle piece, and then we're putting it together to flesh out a better picture. In Falsification, you got a section on League of Nations, and for me, that's also very important because their end goal, I view, is a world federation or world government. And so you have League of Nations, United Nations. Now they're talking about BRICS creating a new world organization, or being added on, reforming the UN to make a UN 2.0. Just your thoughts on these organizations. And then, EU, I always say the EU is the model. for world government, because they want regional unions, and then you have like 10 or so, whatever, 10, a dozen regional unions, and those become the foundation sort of for, the capstone of the UN, or maybe they create some other new organization. And it was interesting just over the weekend, the Eastern globalist, the European globalist leaders have invited Putin back. So from G7 now, we want to go back to G8. So we're letting Russia back into the fold. So any thoughts on some of these organizations and where you see them going?
Yeah, I mean, what you said about the EU is absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, they're trying to destroy the sovereignty of nations because they want a one world government. This has been in the pipeline for decades. They've talked about it for decades. So, it's not just a new thing. But yeah, the EU is a model. But they're trying to do it in the other continents as well. They're trying to do it in Asia. They're trying to do it in South America. They're trying to do it in Africa, and they tried to do it in North America as well. But I don't think it ever came to fruition, where they were going to merge Canada, the US, and Mexico. Do you remember all that stuff?
Yeah.
What was it called? NAFTA or something? Was it called?
Right. Yeah. We're NAFTA now. We're on NAFTA 2.0, as I call it, USMCA. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right. So I mean, they were going to just completely obliterate the borders, but I guess that's quite a huge step. That's not a baby step. So that's probably in the pipeline for the future in some way. Maybe they'll even use a false flag to bring that about. Who knows? But that's the kind of thing that they do. But yeah, they want a one world government, no countries, no religions other than their own. They want a one world police force, a one world army. And because they believe that's the best way they control us. And this is what it's all about. It's all about control, surreptitious control, and not so surreptitious control. Because, as I said, right back at the beginning, the only way that a few thousand can control 8 billion of us, or however many there are, I'm not sure it's 8 billion, but they tell us it is. That's the only way they can control us, by constantly reshaping the world in the image that they want it to be. And this is what things like the EU and all the other stuff that we just mentioned is all about. It's sickening, really, because they're destroying people's cultures in doing it. Not just doing it by destroying borders, they're doing it by mass immigration as well, as you're probably aware of. It's happening in the States. It's happening massively in Europe. The UK population is something like 48% non-white now, and in the next 10 years it will be 60-odd% non-white. So they're destroying the white race as well as our culture. So I know that's a very controversial topic, but nevertheless it's the truth, and that's all I'm interested in. So
you mentioned the New World Religion. I want to. It's a good segue to another question I had from a section in your book on Tavistock, right? And
all right,
I posted on my socials recently. I talked about Jazz Coleman of The Killing Joke, the British metal band, and I sent to Jacob Nordengard, Swedish researcher who's been on the podcast, and he wasn't aware of this. He told me that Jazz Coleman, he's an occultist. He follows Alice Bailey, Lucis Trust, Theosophy. He's an adept of or disciple of Aleister Crowley, and he was actually commissioned by Lucis Trust to write the music. He did a Gnostic mass, and he did music for Lucis Trust's Great Invocation. And it's funny, just over the weekend, Lucis Trust sends out in their newsletter, they created a brand new website called greatinvocation.org, a world prayer, a mantram for the new age. And effectively, they're talking about this invocation to bring about the Antichrist. I mean, they're talking about the Christ, the world the world teacher who appears in every world religion. And going back to Jazz Coleman, he's given interviews where he talks about he took a photo of himself in front of Tavistock Institute, and he admitted that he was part of the Tavistock project to eliminate the Abrahamic religions, particularly Christianity, but also bring in sort of, as you alluded to, their religion. And Tavistock, I haven't talked enough about Tavistock. There's not as many books. You got John Coleman, Daniel Esselin did a book on Tavistock. What's your take on Tavistock?
Yeah, it's not something I've majored in. I've only really kind of broadly, basically touched upon it. But yeah, Tavistock, what can I tell you? It's just another one of those factions that are part of the overall control network. They seem to me to be primarily concerned with, the cultural side of things. In other words, molding the culture to what they want to see. And, again, they always do it in tiny baby steps, but they're very prominent in that. Other than that, really, it's a bit blurry. I can't give you a precise definition of what they're all about. I know I've written about it, but it was a long time ago, and I can't remember the details. I'm sorry.
No, but it's a cultural, and in the past century it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I feel a lot of the podcast space now is their basically the fields that they're working in, plus movie and music. What about the wars? How do you feel the world wars? You've touched on some of them. How does that play in? And I kind of view the wars as one of their primary detonation mechanisms to move, make huge advances on the chessboard.
Absolutely, yeah, that's what it's all about. The grand chessboard, isn't it? It's 2 world wars were contrived. This is a very long story, and I've written about it at length in my book Behind the Curtain, which goes into far more detail about various historical events than Falsification of History. Falsification of History is just a very broad overview, if you like, for kind of newish comers to this kind of world. But the 2 world wars, they were first mooted in 1890. They were a person who was involved in the planning of them was the guy who became King Edward VII. He was the eldest son of Queen Victoria, and he acceded the throne when she died in 1901. But prior to that, while he was still Prince of Wales, which is heir to the throne, he was involved in planning World Wars I and II. And the two were actually meant, World War I was actually meant to lay the foundations for the World War II. World War I was to actually destroy the European royal families, basically, majorly the Russian royal family, because the Russian royal family were very, very anti-New World Order. In 1819, I believe it was, they tried, the powers that shouldn't be, as I call them, decided to kind of have a fledgling League of Nations type organization. Okay, and it almost went through. The plans almost went through, apart from the fact that the Russian royal family at that time thwarted the Rothschilds, who were behind the plan, and they decided that they were not going to support it. And that was a big thing, because Russia was a big place. It still is, funnily enough. And and the Rothschild family never forgot that. So the destruction of the Russian royal family in 1917, not only was it part of the agenda for World War I, but it was also done in revenge for what the Russian royal family had done in 1819. I think it was, don't quote me on it, but it was in the 18 teens.
Just on that point real quick, you're
Sure.
right. I've got an academic book behind me. I think it's called Mark Mazauer, Governing the World, which I read. And he mentions, I think, 1815, the Concert of Europe. And he says in that book, that was their first, 1815, as you say, if you think about it.
I was 4 years out already.
And that was the first attempt. I mean, people think about, Royal Institute, League of Nations, 19 teens. But way back in, as you say, 1815, that was the first attempt to unify Europe, really, in that sense.
So, but as I said, Russia did not go along with it. They actually thwarted the plan completely. So the Rothschilds swore bloody revenge on them. And the one thing about these people, I mean the real controllers of the world, not governments, they are very patient people. They have many, many long-term plans. And long-term plans, 100 years to them is nothing. So it took 100 years, but eventually they got rid of the Russian royal family in the Russian Revolution, which was obviously a communist, Marxist plot to take over the country. And they hoped from that communism would spread out from Russia right through Europe, and it almost did. But it actually died a death eventually with the end of the Soviet Union. But that's another story. But the First World War led directly to the Second World War, because obviously Germany was blamed, even though It wasn't Germany that started the war, but again, this is a huge topic, and I don't want to go into masses and masses of detail and bore everybody to death, but just try and give you an overview. Germany didn't start World War I and didn't start World War II either, but again, that's another story for another day. But one of the ideas was to destroy Germany as a nation, which actually took till the end of the Second World War to do that. And then they rebuilt it in their own image, if you like. So, part of what happened in World War I was something called the Balfour Declaration, which was basically the UK giving Palestine to the Jews, which they had about as much, at that time, Palestine was owned by Turkey. So the UK had as much right to give Palestine to the Jews, and I use this phrase quite a lot, as China would have to give Wales to Japan. It was, but again, it's all theatre. There are, even though we still pretend that there are no real country borders as far as these people are concerned. It sits above countries, it sits above nations, it sits above governments. These people just regard the whole world as their, phrase that you used, chessboard. So so what happened was they knew that they couldn't fulfill that promise within that war. So what they did was they actually decimated Germany to such an extent, and the communists almost took over in Germany at the end of World War I. It became that close to taking over until a certain man appeared on the scene by the name of Adolf Hitler, who drove the country forward and created about as close to a utopian state as there's ever been. But again, that's another story for another time. Cut a long story short, World War II was all about establishing the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And people like Winston Churchill, who were some of the main drivers of that war, they were in the payment of the Zionists, the Jews. Churchill drove the war in the direction that the Zionists wanted it to go, and he was paid very, very handsomely for it as well. And got proof of this. So again, that's not up for question. This is not something up for debate, really. It's categoric fact. It's documented. It was paid something like £200,000 a year in the 1940s, which was it was quite a bit of money.
If we had to extrapolate, so we've kind of gotten sort of to modern day. Would you say the powers that be, obviously they're much more consolidated. If you had to extrapolate forward, the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where do you see us? Where do you see them trying to take us?
Well, further down that road. We just talked about the EU and all the other different conglomerations of nations. They're just trying to destroy all the borders. If they get their own way, and I will add that kind of precursor to it. If they get their own way, what they want is a whole world made up like the EU, where there are no borders. And then, of course, they'll take it a stage further and a stage further and a stage further, because this is how they work. They do it in baby steps. They don't do it in huge leaps, because they know that there'll be a pushback. So they do it very, very quietly under the carpet, change the law here, change the rules there, make an amendment, make an adjustment here, make an adjustment there. So nobody notices, and just slowly. It's the old boiling frog syndrome, isn't it? You put the frog in the pot and start to heat the water 1 degree at a time, and it doesn't notice until it's too late, and it can't jump out because it's dead. So I just see, but I always have when I talk like this, I always want to add a note of optimism, and the note of optimism that I'll add in here is that over the years that I've been doing this, and it's nearly 30 years now, I would say 99%, I'll put it as high as that, of things that they've tried to do never come to fruition. Now, that might surprise a few people, but it's absolutely true. Okay, 99% is a bit of a guess, but it feels like 99%. They've been talking about World War III for decades, absolutely decades. What happens? Nothing. They kind of go partway towards it, such as we saw in Ukraine recently and Russia, and then it all fizzles out and they move on to something else because there is no appetite for it. And this is what they're trying to do with false flags. They're trying to generate an appetite for their next step through the agenda. And it doesn't always come to fruition. At the moment in Britain, they're talking about digital IDs. There's just been a 3 million signature petition gone into the Parliament to debate this. Whether that will happen, I don't know, but there is a massive, massive pushback. I don't think they'll do it. 30 years ago, when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, 30, 40 years ago, there was something that she tried to introduce, something called the poll tax, which taxed people based on their ability to vote. And that, there was a massive pushback against that, and that never came to fruition. There's been lots and lots of things like that. So, I don't necessarily believe that they get their own way all the time. In fact, I think the opposite is true. Most of the time, they don't. So I, as always, remain fairly positive that things will pan out in a way that isn't as bad as predicted. But that's probably the best thing I can say.
We've got some, white pills. So good news for listeners. Yeah. White pill, and I think that is a strong point. I mean, you do have a point when I look at the British history. Out there on Airstrip 1 for decades, they've been trying to push the national. I mean, since like the 1940s, I think.
Yeah.
It's almost a century that they've failed implementing national ID in the UK. So, I mean, you do have a strong point. What is to be done then in your mind to resist, push back?
Yeah, I mean, protests. I'm not a massive believer in them, but I think one thing that protests do is that they kind of bring the attention to other people as much as it does to the governments or the powers that shouldn't be. And, so, yeah, I think that's great. We've had lots of protests in Britain since the advent of COVID. 2 million people turning out marching in London has not been that rare. That's happened quite a few times on various different topics. Obviously, the media report it has been very small numbers. I think the BBC, the last one, which was against the digital ID a couple of months ago, I think there was 2.5 million people there by all reports. But of course, the media reported it as a couple of 100,000, to try and play it down. But it does actually stir people up. They think, well, if so many people are fighting against this, then, maybe I should look into that. No, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but, I think that kind of does spread the word. So, yeah, it's never easy. I mean, we can't fight them with tanks and bombs. There's no or guns. We just can't do it because they just crush us. But it's just an information war, I guess. It's an information war, and what we're doing here today, for you, tonight for me, is spread that word. There might be someone listening to this or watching this interview now who thinks, oh, okay, yeah, I'll look into this a little bit more. And if that's the case, then we've done our job, and that's all we can do. There is no magic wand to wave, unfortunately. Yeah. And no simple answer. A bit there.
Yeah, but you have, as you said, you have your little puzzle piece, as do we all, and we're putting them together. If you have any other final thoughts, and then you're with the work that you're doing, you want to tell us about the work that you're doing and where you plan to, what do you plan to keep doing? What direction you plan to take that in the future?
Right. Well, as I said at the beginning, we with another co-author, not Shannon, a different, my friend Andy, we wrote a book, was published earlier this year called 60 Degrees South, which is a novel, but it's a novel full of truth bombs, and it's about what's going on in Antarctica. Of course, we don't know, do we? They don't tell us, and you're not allowed to go there, by the way. It's called 60 Degrees South because you're not allowed to travel beyond 60 degrees south without authorization. And if you do, and you won't turn back when the United Nations Antarctic Interceptor Force ask you to do, politely, I'm very sure, they will blow you out of the water or out of the air if you're in a plane. and it has happened. There's documented instances of that happening. People trying to go beyond that 60th parallel. But anyway, that's what the book's about: speculation and its truth bombs, blah blah blah. So we're writing a sequel to it because, by popular request, we've had some amazing reviews. People have asked, saying, "Oh, come on, we want a sequel to this," So yeah, that's what we're doing. We're writing a sequel at the moment. We're about halfway through it. Should be published in probably about March, I guess. So yeah, and other than my ongoing schedule of podcasts, I'm editing a book for a friend, as I said. Also, I've got 3 talks coming up before Christmas. So busy boy. And I'm glad to say.
Yeah, and where's the links are in the description, but where's the best place for people to your websites and to get your books?
Yeah, you can, if you're in the UK. I don't know how many viewers you have in the UK, but if you're in the UK, you can buy my books at falsificationofhistory.co.uk. There's an online store there. You can buy signed copies. Other than that, if you're elsewhere in the world, or even if you're in the UK, there's always good old Amazon, and that's it's a necessary evil, unfortunately. The vast majority of my income comes from Amazon, I'm sad to say, but what can you do? There is also a website called 60-degrees-south.com, which is quite a topical website about the latest book, which, there's some quite interesting information on there if anybody's interested in that. Yeah, so...
I'll include all the links in the description, so if people are curious, they can go further. And I like to joke. May the odds be ever in your favor, John. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, my friend. It's been an absolute pleasure. Great to talk to you.